precisely what we are doing. I have read the Daily Record this morning. Can I give my sympathies to Siobhan McMahon? Her thunder has obviously been stolen by the Deputy Leader of Scottish Labour.
We now move to First Minister's questions. Question number 1, Joanne Lamont.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. To ask the First Minister what engagements he has planned for the rest of the day.
First Minister.
Engagements to take forward the Government's programme for Scotland.
Joanne Lamont.
Thank you. Does the First Minister support the living wage?
First Minister.
Not only do we support the living wage, but of course we introduced the living wage across the government-controlled public sector in Scotland.
Joanne Lamont.
The First Minister will know that there are more than 400,000 working people in Scotland who earn less than the living wage. Nearly 2/3 of them are women. Being paid the living wage could mean an increase of around £2,000 a year to each of them. So, if the First Minister is committed to making a difference to these people's lives, why did the SNP vote down Labour's plans, which would have guaranteed a living wage to every worker from every firm bidding for a government contract?
First Minister.
Firstly,
Order. First Minister.
in terms of credentials on the living wage, I think the credentials are with the government, this government, the SNP government, who introduced it, as opposed to a Labour administration who never introduced it when they were in office. And secondly, in terms of the procurement bill, let's get it right. We are pursuing the living wage, but obviously doing it in a way which is compliant with EU legislation, as was well explained. But Joanne Lamont, if she's going to question our credentials in seeking the living wage for Scottish workers and campaigning, would I like to explain how governments of which she was a member, a minister, never occurred to them to introduce the living wage when in office. This government did it, and we're proud of it.
Joanne Lamont.
He didn't answer the question. He was asked about what his government did last week to improve the rights of ordinary working people. Now, we know that legal advice in the EU isn't the First Minister's strong point, but we have advice here which clearly states it can be done. We have a statement from the European Commission which says it can be done. Even an old Etonian like Boris Johnson can ensure that workers in London can ensure the living wage. But in Scotland, we have a First Minister who looks for reasons not to do things. Let's look at his record on low pay. When Labour introduced the minimum wage, Alex-Salmond was in his bed. When there was work to be done in his constituency office, he advertised for an unpaid intern rather than let someone earn a day's pay. And he spends £10 billion of our money on procurement, yet he denies hard-working people across Scotland the right to a living wage. Why should working people across Scotland, battling against the scourge of low pay, trust the First Minister when he won't lift a finger to help them now?
First Minister.
The answer to our question is in the second sentence of my last answer. But if she has this legal advice, then stage 3 is still to come in this legislation. Bring forward the advice, and then we can work jointly to introduce the living wage in terms of procurement, if that legal advice is solid. But she'll agree with me that it would affect no benefit to workers in Scotland if we were to try and do something which was then immediately shot down by the European Commission. Of course, we're now talking about an argument which says, should this be introduced in terms of the minimum wage? And significantly, of course, the last time that Labour were in government, they failed to protect the minimum wage in terms of inflation, something which the SNP government has guaranteed to do once this Parliament and this country get control of the minimum wage as well as the living wage. But our credentials in this matter, the protection that's been offered across the government-controlled public sector, the campaigns we've had it, makes our credentials impeccable. So why cannot any member of this chamber explain how it took an SNP government in this chamber in Scotland to introduce the living wage across the public sector in Scotland? Let me repeat, something we did not talked about something we did and something we're proud about.
Joanne Lamont.
First of all, the legal advice was available at stage 2, and the Minister encouraged his backbenchers to vote it down. And the First Minister gives promise of jam tomorrow when independence comes, rather than making a difference right now. That is the business of government, what you can do right now. The First Minister claims to be a progressive beacon, yet after 7 years of government, he can't name a single policy that redistributes wealth from the rich to the poor. He guarantees big business a tax cut 3 pence in the pound lower than anything a Tory Chancellor would contemplate. But he won't match Labour in asking those with the broadest shoulders, those people earning more than £150,000 a year, to pay a bit more in tax. So Labour will bring forward our amendments on the living wage again at stage 3. Will the First Minister ensure that he backs them, or will he vote for poverty pay?
First Minister.
It's not new legal advice, it's the same old legal advice that Labour previously presented. The objective of the procurement bill is to promote the living wage. That's why that aspect of the procurement bill was brought forward. Let me repeat, this government introduced the living wage across the public sector in Scotland, which might have had something to do with the alleviation of poverty wages. We actually did that, something that the Labour Party didn't manage to do either here or, for that matter, down in Westminster. Now, the aspects in terms of what we're doing to affect and to deal with poverty in Scotland and the measures we can introduce. Do we not remember it's only a few weeks since the Labour Party voted against the extension of free school meals from primaries 1 to 3 in Scotland? Luckily, of course, this party now has a majority in this Parliament, and we were able to bring it forward with the support of the Anti-Poverty Alliance in Scotland. And then, of course, we're back to the top rate of taxation, and I pointed out to Joanne Lamont that it was the SNP who moved against the reduction of top rate tax from 50 to 45p in 2012. And where were the Labour Party? Well, they weren't asleep in their beds. They decided to deliberately abstain as an act of policy. But I'm glad that Joanne Lamont is now secure in these matters, because asked in a remarkable Newsnight Scotland interview on Tuesday night, twice she refused to commit herself to increasing the top rate of taxation. When asked, she said, I quote her exactly, "There is a separate argument about how these powers are used. That is a dialogue we need to have with the people of Scotland." I suggest she has a dialogue with people in her own party, so as we can get something decent in terms of proposals from the Labour Party. Proposals which Reform Scotland have pointed out won't raise 40%, as claimed on Tuesday, but 26% of the expenditure of this Parliament. Even people who were previously favourable to the proposals of the Labour Party have now pointed out their extraordinary deficiencies. Why is it that the yes vote is increasing month by month, poll by poll? Because people in Scotland look at Tory government from Westminster, they remember Labour government in Scotland, and see a government of our own in Scotland will be a government which ensures both prosperity and fairness across Scottish society.
Question number 2. Ruth Davidson.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. To ask the First Minister when he'll next meet the Secretary of State for Scotland.
First Minister.
No plans, near future.
Davidson.
2 years ago, the Scottish Government predicted that oil and gas receipts would be up to £7.2 billion. In reality, they were £6.1 billion. Last year, they predicted oil receipts totalling up to £8.3 billion. So far, with 10 months of that collected, the current total is actually £4.7 billion. In the White Paper, to even begin to balance an independent Scotland's books, the Scottish Government predicts oil revenues of up to £7.9 billion in 2016-17.
Order, I'd like to hear Ms Davidson, if you don't mind.
But yesterday, the OBR said receipts for that same year was more likely to be £3.2 billion, which is less than half. The First Minister wildly overstated the case last year. He overstated the case for this year. Why should we gamble the future funding of our hospitals and our schools on a man with such a track record?
First Minister.
The proposals in the White Paper, of course, pointed out of a historic share of debt, the percentage deficit in Scotland would be between 1.6 and 2.4% in 2016-17. The then forecast for the UK from the OBR was 2.2% in terms of the UK deficit. That was the revision downwards at the budget of this year. Remember, the OBR has changed its forecast on growth in the economy by 50% over the last year, a quite extraordinary achievement. If we remember back to the first Conservative Party budget, then we should be moving into a happy situation of surplus by next year, according to the fancy. That happy state is now to be delayed to the years 2018-19. The OBR has changed its oil forecast up and down every 6 months. Therefore, I would think that based on certain factors, based on a reasonable forecast of oil price, as opposed to one that's $20 lower than the Department of Energy and Climate Change, dependent on an increase in production, which the industry says will be the result of the extraordinary investment that we're seeing currently in the North Sea, then the figures that we've outlined are robust. We're not going to go down the method. Well, we don't need a crystal ball to see the clarity of forecasts from George Osborne or the OBR. They change every 5 minutes in terms of upwards and downwards. And, of course, it's quite useful sometimes to look at the fine print. Only last night we discovered that of the £300 million adjustment in oil figures for 2016, no less than £200 million has got the reallocation of offshore corporation tax to onshore corporation tax. A remarkable thing for a Tory Chancellor to forget to announce in the middle of his budget 6 months before the referendum. So when we look at a Conservative Party who for the last 30 years has been telling us that North Sea oil isn't really worth all that much and is going to run out, who've taken in a fair share, some £300 billion of Scottish oil revenues over these last 30 to 40 years, then I think looking at the next 40 years, the majority of people in Scotland will say it's time that Scotland had a shot at a share of our great natural resources. And as opposed to the Conservative Party, who think this is an enormous burden, the vast majority of people in Scotland will see it as one of the great advantages of controlling our resources in an independent Scotland.
Ruth Davidson.
The First Minister's robust figures on oil are predicated on the fact that a barrel wouldn't drop below $113. Today it's trading at $105. And it's interesting that the First Minister would criticise the OBR, because this time last year, when the referendum wasn't 6 months away, we found that the Finance Secretary had said, and I'll quote directly, the OBR's forecasts set out alongside the UK's March budget have not been seriously challenged by the industry or by independent commentators. What a difference a year makes. Now, I'm willing to concede that none of us here know exactly what the oil price will be in 2016-17. But the First Minister's own Nobel laureates have already told him that he should, and again I'll quote directly, plan budgets on a cautious estimate for oil revenues, which is good advice, but unfortunately it is advice that the First Minister is not following, because more than double the most recent projections doesn't sound like being cautious to me. It sounds downright reckless. It has now been over a year since the First Minister dashed out his dodgy oil figures in the analytical bulletin. He promised us regular updates, but so far we've not had any. So when will the First Minister update his figures, and does he accept that he will have to revise them down?
First Minister.
Well, let's talk firstly about prices, which Ruth Davidson accused us of being over-ambitious on. I was pointing out the OBR forecast now, and it's a revision from their last forecast, a revision upwards, $99 a barrel in 2016-17. She rightly says, or I should make this exact, we are forecasting $113. The Department of Energy and Climate Change, it's a UK Government department, are forecasting $120 for that year. The OECD are forecasting up to $140 to the end of the decade, and other forecasts are even higher. So therefore, the $113 is not an unreasonable estimate, given by our same logic that we're already some $9 ahead of the OBR forecast for this current year. So therefore, I think in prices, there's a reasonable case to be made that this is not an over-ambitious forecast, but a very sensible one. In terms of production, the OBR remarkably do not take the Department of Energy and Climate Change forecast in production, having refused to take their forecast in prices. And they are the only people who think that the massive investment that's going into the North Sea at the present moment is going to result, according to the OBR, in no increase in production, totally against the arguments which the UK Government endorsed in the Wood report. But can I offer Ruth Davidson, the final authority on these matters, the man who can never be, in her estimation, wrong, a person who said that North Sea is a real jewel in the crown of the United Kingdom economy. I think it's encouraging that we see this year we're seeing a growth in production as a number of new fields and projects come on stream. David Cameron on the 12th of June 2013. So even the Prime Minister is forecasting an increase in production that the OBR alone say is not going to happen. I think in this light, given the evidence of the last 40 years, then I think people are more likely to believe a Scottish Government forecast and estimations of Scottish natural resources than a Tory party who've pocketed £300 billion of Scottish resources over the last 40 years. And if we allow them the opportunity, will happily pocket another £300 billion over the next 40 years.
Question 3, Aileen MacLeod.
To ask the First Minister whether the Scottish Government will continue to provide free prescriptions.
First Minister.
Yes.
Aileen MacLeod.
Can I thank the First Minister for his assurance that free prescriptions will be protected by this SNP Government. Last week, the Prescription Charges Coalition in England, which brings together over 20 charities supporting people with long-term conditions, stated in its latest report that over one-third of people questioned reported that the cost of their medication had prevented them from taking it as prescribed. Now, in light of this, does the First Minister agree with me that the proposals by the Scottish Conservative Party to abolish free prescriptions is not only socially divisive, but represents an utterly obscene tax on ill health that is bound to hit hardest the most vulnerable in our society and undermine progress made in Scotland?
I think we've got the question. First Minister.
Well, I think people will find it significant that Ruth Davidson didn't want to ask a question on what was the highlight announcement of the Tory party conference, to introduce a sick tax on people in Scotland. But the member's quite right. I mean, David Barker of Crohn's and Colitis UK, who leads the Prescription Charges Coalition, says people with long-term conditions in Scotland do not face the barrier to effective treatment that those in England still do. As a result of an unfair, outdated, arbitrary system of exemptions, research shows that many with long-term conditions in England are severely compromising their health through being unable to afford prescription charges. Can I say to the Conservative Party that the argument that you are going to emphasise your credentials by cutting this tax and that tax and the next tax, while simultaneously making the highlight of your conference an announcement you're going to put a tax on ill health on the Scottish people and have us back into the situation that David Barker rightly speaks of in the unfairness in England, is not a policy which is going to increase your support. It's going to be a policy which diminishes your attendances at your annual conference, if indeed that were possible.
Jackson Carlaw.
Well, in a year when we had a record attendance, that's certainly something. Neither Neither the question nor the First Minister's response were a surprise. But how can he justify continuing to put hard-pressed resources into a ham-fisted, universal, non-targeted tax cut, which has undoubtedly benefited the astonishing number of £100,000 salary-rich ministers sitting in the front bench, rather than our priority of putting the resource into the recruitment of 1,000 additional nurses who could make a huge contribution to our National Health Service?
First Minister.
There has been a rise in qualified nurses and midwives since we took office in Scotland, and rightly so. If I could remind, and now we see that if it comes to trying to promulgate difficult policies, then of course there's a delegation of power to the deputy in these matters, and I can see why. I can see exactly why that would be the case. As far as Jackson Carlaw should remember, if he goes to the barricades on this one, he might reach with a dusty answer. The cut-off point was £16,000. Can I remember back in 2008-9 when the analysis was done? £16,000 was when 600,000 people in Scotland actually faced prescription charges. That was the extent of the unfairness that was going on, and would be revisited in Scotland if the Conservative Party had their way. And I do hope that no other party in this chamber is going to go down the road of reimposing the tax on the sick. As for the record attendance at the Tory conference, can I look to the Sunday Post for information on this? The Sunday Post, it says, can also reveal that desperate Tory bosses sent out invitations to non-party members in a bid to fill the empty seats at the conference.
First Minister, it's very interesting, but it's nothing to do with prescription charges. Question 4, Jamie Hepburn. Jamie Hepburn.
To ask the First Minister what the Scottish Government's response is to the 2014 UK budget.
First Minister.
The Scottish Government will be making a statement before the Easter recess on the budget consequentials and the impacts of the budget in Scottish society. It would be the last Westminster chance to create opportunity in Scotland and depart from the austerity programme. That chance seems to have been missed, and the analysis of our Finance Secretary before the Easter recess will examine completely the likely impact of that continued austerity programme in Scotland.
Jamie Hepburn.
In the face of many struggling as a result of their policies, the Conservatives have callously claimed this budget is good for hard-working people because in a cut to the cost of beer and bingo. Can the First Minister set out what the real cost is to families in Scotland as a result of Westminster's austerity agenda, particularly those families on lower incomes?
First Minister.
Well, you can actually find that in terms of the UK Government's own report, the analysis of impact on household and distributional analysis which accompanies this budget. And what it shows in this particular Westminster game of bingo, it's the only game of bingo where everyone's a loser, because the average loss for families is £757 a year. Now, it is true that the top quartile lose £2,000, but the second biggest loss, according to the UK Government's own figures, is in families at the very bottom of the income distribution, losing £814, according to this analysis. So when we get that condescending poster posted by Graham Snaps, the Conservative Party chairman, which was Shaps told us that cutting the bingo and beer duty was to help hard-working people do more of the things they enjoy, then perhaps a lot of folk in Scotland will look at that and say 88 is a millionaire's tax break, 25 is the NHS privatised, and all the threes are tuition fees, which is why the Conservative Party will continue to be rejected by the people of Scotland.
Ian Gray.
In the spirit of trying to find something positive to say about what I agree with the First Minister was a bad budget for the vast majority of families across the United Kingdom, in the budget, support for employers was extended to create up to 100,000 new apprenticeship-related jobs over 2 years. This is a scheme which does not exist in Scotland, but the consequentials of around £16 million will. Will the First Minister apply these resources to extending the apprenticeship programme and increasing opportunity for our young people?
First Minister.
Well, as the As Ian Gray should know, the consequentials are extremely limited over the next 2 years, but the finance sector will set out how exactly we tend to allocate these consequentials before the Easter recess. I would say, just as a gentle reminder to Ian Gray, that this government has increased apprentices in Scotland by 60% from the levels that we inherited. An absolutely crucial thing, an absolutely key thing of our apprenticeship programme in Scotland is that all the people in apprenticeships are employed, which is absolutely necessary in terms of having a joint interest of both the apprentice and their employer in their future success. So obviously we always look at ways to improve the lot of young people in Scotland. The debate yesterday in the European Youth Guarantee was part of that process. But let's remember the success we've already had in the apprenticeship scheme. And under the financial circumstances of the last few years, a 60% increase in apprentices from 16,000 to over 25,000 is no mean achievement.
Gavin Brown.
Presiding Officer, a few minutes ago the First Minister accused the Conservative leader of passing the buck down to the Deputy Leader. I don't think he's in a terribly strong position to do that, Presiding Officer. But on the budget yesterday... I was hoping you'd get to that, Mr Brown. Which of the savings and pensions measures from yesterday does he not support? First Minister.
Well, we welcomed a number of the measures on savings, while of course pointing out that while of course there are benefits for people in extending the amount that can be saved tax-free in an ISA to £15,000, I think the Conservative Party would do well to remember that the average income wage in Scotland is some £17,000, and therefore for many, many families in Scotland, the right to be able to save £15,000 cash-free ISA is something of a theoretical right. And when and if and ever the Conservative Party start to show some affinity, not like the Tory party chairman, with the reality of what families in Scotland are suffering and enduring at the present moment, then and only then, which I think will extend long beyond his and mine political career, will the Conservative Party be able to restore their fortunes. Is it not possible to understand that people look at this Conservative Party and they see a party of vested interest as opposed to one of the people's interest?
Question number 5, Jenny Mara.
To ask the First Minister what steps the Scottish Government is taking to tackle human trafficking.
First Minister.
Well, we're working to ensure that police and prosecutors have the powers they need to make Scotland a hostile place for traffickers, to raise awareness among public and organisations about the potential signs of trafficking, and to ensure that tailored support packages are available for the victims of this heinous crime. We are grateful to Jenny Mara for the interest in this agenda. The responses to our consultation on a possible Members' Bill confirmed strong support for Scottish human trafficking legislation. And as Ms Mara knows, we have confirmed on Monday the 17th of March the Scottish Government will bring forward a human trafficking bill in this parliamentary session to further strengthen that response.
Jenny Mara.
I thank the First Minister for taking on the bill and using his majority to put this important legislation on the statute book in Scotland. The most important part of this bill is the legal right for victims to get the support they need. One trafficking victim is identified in Scotland every 4 days, and we believe this to be the tip of the iceberg. Will the First Minister commit today to enacting the Survivor Service and Survivor Standards as approved by 51,000 members of the public to ensure that victims of this human rights abuse in our communities get the legal right of support for recovery that they desperately need?
First Minister.
Well, we'll look at the proposals in a sympathetic manner, and the aim and objective will be to consolidate and strengthen the existing criminal law, to enhance the status of and support for the victims of trafficking, will require relevant agencies to work with the Scottish Government to develop and implement that anti-trafficking strategy. And I'm sure as we develop that dialogue, we'll produce a piece of legislation that everyone in this chamber, I hope everyone in this chamber, will believe will improve the lot of the victims and be of great credit to this Parliament and to Scotland.
Question number 6, Alex Johnson.
To ask the First Minister what assessment of the Scottish Government has made of the cost of an independent Scotland's welfare system, and whether it would seek to the cooperation of the UK Government in its implementation.
First Minister.
Well, as Alex Johnson will know, the expenditure on social protection as a share of gross domestic product is estimated to have been lower in Scotland than the UK in each of the past 5 years, accounting for 15.5% of GDP in Scotland and 16% in the UK in 2012-2013. Alex Johnson will also know that the transitional period of shared administration was recommended by the Expert Working Group on Welfare, and we agree with that view.
Alex Johnson.
I am aware of the First Minister's figures. He has given them in answers before. However, it is clear that monies within the Scottish budget as a whole are already allocated to other priorities, and that with a theoretical deficit of £12.1 billion built into the last full year's figures, any additional money which is promised to the welfare system, and that is regularly promised by his backbenchers, will have to be accounted for somewhere. So could he at this point tell us whether it will be through cuts in other areas of expenditure, through increases in taxation, or additional borrowing to the £12.1 billion he would have to address?
First Minister.
Well, I've already pointed out to Ruth Davidson that if Alex Johnson examines the White Paper, you'll see the projections for 2016-17, so Scotland in a stronger fiscal position than the rest of the UK at that period. But in terms of the White Paper, can I point out the detail in this that we pointed out that Scotland delivers almost all parts of the current benefit system to people living in Scotland from locations in Scotland. That was paragraph 450. And Scotland provides a wide range of services to England, such as working age benefit process for London, services for pensioners in England involve a claimant count measured in millions and thousands. And I make the point because Alex Johnson, who talks about deficits in Scotland, seems totally oblivious to the fact that the UK deficit, the deficit of the United Kingdom, the deficit of George Osborne is over £100 billion. So just some appreciation of the plank of wood in his Chancellor's eye, it would perhaps help him before he looks for some specks of sawdust in the Scottish Governments.
John Mason.
Thank you. Would the First Minister agree that the best way to deliver a fairer society is not just to tinker around the edges of devolution, but for this place to have control over the whole social security system and the tax system and the statutory minimum wage?
First Minister.
I should point out to Alex Johnson, in fairness, as I addressed that question, that that last quote was for Willie Rennie's benefit, but he turns out not to be here since he wanted me to quote the Bible more last week. But I agree with John Mason. Only the full fiscal powers of independence will allow key decisions in tax, wealth and employment policy to be made in Scotland by those who have Scotland's best interests at heart. The figures I read out earlier about the impact on families of all of the tax and benefit measures, these are figures from the UK Government's own papers published yesterday. I cannot understand, given the extent and depth of the recession, given the suffering which has been endured by people in all categories of income, while the second biggest impact of all, in a situation where all families on average are less well off, but why on earth should the second biggest impact fall on those least able to bear that burden? And that's why I would think a Scottish Government of any political complexion would reflect the general interest of the Scottish people, and why we absolutely must have tax and benefits under the control of this Parliament.
Thank you. That ends First Minister's questions. We will be moving to members' business. Members who are leaving the chamber should do so quickly and quietly. And I'll pause for a few minutes to allow members to leave, the gallery to clear, and those people who wish to come into the gallery for the members' debate to take up their seats.